Good afternoon, everyone. We should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered for this meeting. For thousands of years, the land has been the home of the Patwin people, including the Yocha Dehe Winti Nation today. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here on their traditional lands. Today, we are welcoming Joanna Solins, an environmental horticultural advisor for UC Cooperative Extension in Sacramento, Solano, and Yolo counties. She began her career in education and communications before returning to graduate school to study urban plant ecology. Her current research investigates relationships between urban plants, water, soils, and people in California with a focus on climate appropriate trees and water wise landscaping. Joanna holds a PhD in ecology and an MA in geography from the University of California, Davis, and a BA in environmental studies from Vassar College. She'll be speaking about sustainable practices for beautiful landscapes in Yolo County. Lastly, please use the chat to ask questions, and there may be a link at the end of the program for an evaluation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Joan. I'm really happy to be here. As was mentioned, I did all of my graduate work at UC Davis, and so I've been in Yolo County for quite some time now. And it's a place I love and really, really care about keeping our landscapes beautiful. So thank you all so much for being here today. To give you, uh, we're gonna not advance. Okay, there we go. So just to give an overview of where this talk is going today, we'll talk a little bit first about climate considerations for gardening in Yolo County, specifically talking about Yolo County's climate and what strategies our native plants use to cope with that. And sorry, you'd think after years of Zoom, I'd have this 100% dialed in, but every time something goes a little bit differently. All right, so we'll also talk about how to protect our existing landscapes from some of the changes that we're seeing related to heat and smoke. And most of the talk will be looking at strategies for climate resilience and sustainable landscaping in Yolo County. So we'll talk about water-wise landscaping, trees for cooling, fire-smart landscaping, and plant and tree selection. So starting out with some climate considerations for Yolo County. First of all, I want to talk about what actually is climate and how do we distinguish climate from weather. So, weather, to start out with, is basically the state of the atmosphere at a specific time and place. So, these are short-term variations that we see in the atmosphere from minutes to weeks, whereas climate is the prevalent long-term weather conditions in a particular place. So, we're really talking about what kind of weather you can expect in a place over a really long time period, at least 30 years, even thinking about centuries long. And the elements of both weather and climate include precipitation, temperature, humidity, sunshine, wind speed, fog, snow, and other things like that. So essentially, climate is what you expect based on these long-term averages, whereas weather is what you actually get. And of course, both of these have big implications for how we garden and how we take care of our landscapes. And I will say that if you want some more information about weather in California, I highly recommend Weather West by Dr. Daniel Swain, who's also a part of UC Agriculture and Natural Resources, which is our sort of umbrella organization. So he has a blog. He also does sort of office hours and a whole lot of communications about weather and kind of how it connects with climate. And I find his information to be super interesting and informative if you want to keep up to date with what is going on with our weather. So, one thing that we think about with climate zones and plants, our sort of most basic thing that's going to be on pretty much every plant label you ever see is the USDA plant hardiness zone. And this is really based on the annual extreme minimum temperature over the past 30 years. So the rationale for that is that the lowest temperatures are really a crucial factor in plant survival. So we're not just thinking about how cold you can generally expect it to be in January. We're talking about like how cold might it get at a real extreme in January, or another winter month, because that is what might kill off your plants. However, and so for Yolo County, we are largely in 9B with some sections of 9A over in the by the Coast Range. But of course, there's a lot more to climate than just how cold it gets, right? We have a lot of places that might have a similar minimum temperature, but really different high temperatures or really different patterns of precipitation. So in County, we have a Mediterranean climate. This is true for most of California, where we have these cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers. So this graph here shows we have the months across the bottom here from January through December, and we have average precipitation, which is shown in these blue bars, and then our average maximum temperature per month, which is shown by this red line. And you don't have to worry about the actual numbers. I just want you to notice the pattern is that in our winter months, we have a lot of precipitation relatively, when the temperatures are relatively low. And then in the summer, when we have very little precipitation, and of course, these are averages over a long time. So as I'm sure you're well aware, we often get no precipitation at all between about May and October. And that is when our temperatures are at their highest. So, in order to talk about why this is kind of a challenge for plants, I want to go back to the basics, little review, and think about photosynthesis and transpiration. So, photosynthesis is this amazing process that plants have where they use carbon dioxide and water and the energy of the sun to create sugars and oxygen. So plants are essentially created out of thin air, right? They're able to take that carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it into sugars that they can use to grow. And a related process is transpiration. So this is basically just movement of water through the plant. So the roots take up water from the soil. That water is drawn up through the stem to the leaves through tissue that we call xylem. And then water vapor is released from the leaves through pores called stomata. And these stomata are really key to our plant water relations and also to photosynthesis. And the reason for that is that these stomata, so these little pores, so this is a very enlarged microscopic version of stomata. So they're letting carbon dioxide in so that the plant can photosynthesize, right? Because it needs to have that carbon dioxide to create sugars. And at the same time, they're also letting water out. So most plants actually lose several hundred molecules of water for every molecule of carbon dioxide they gain. This water loss is part and parcel of photosynthesis. And the hotter and drier the air is, the more transpiration it drives. Because essentially, when there's less water in the air, there's a greater, this is all physics. I'm not really a physicist, but essentially, when you have full saturation of water at this opening, and then if there's less water in the air, there's more, a bigger driving force for that water to leave the leaf. And transpiration seems like a waste, right? It's like you have to have your pores open to let the carbon dioxide in, and at the same time, you're just losing water willy-nilly. However, that the transpiration is actually really important for the plant as well. It helps to increase nutrient uptake through the roots, and it also provides cooling for the plant, much like sweating provides cooling for us, right? That transformation of liquid water into water vapor takes heat, and so it cools the plant. Now, if a plant is running out of water, it can close its stomata to stop losing that water. But if a plant closes its stomata, it's going to reduce the photosynthesis, the cooling benefits it gets, and that nutrient uptake. And I will mention also that most plants do close their stomata when it's dark out because they need sunlight to photosynthesize. So when there's no sun around, it doesn't make any sense to have your stomata open and lose a bunch of water if you're not able to carry out photosynthesis. There are some plants that have a strategy around that, but most plants will close their stomata in the dark. So, Mediterranean climates are really tough for plants because we have this mismatch between when water is available and when plants really need that water, right? So, water is available in the cold months, um, when there's not as much driving force for water, and the days are also much shorter, which means that there's less time that plants would want to have their stomata open. Whereas in the summer, when we have warm temperatures and long days, there's very little water. So, how do plants that are native to Mediterranean climates cope with this? Some of them just avoid that summer drought altogether. They will grow next to a river where there's water year round. Some of them have an annual life cycle, so they will grow, set seed, and then die before it dries out. And some of them are drought deciduous, so they'll lose their leaves when it gets too dry in the summer. Unlike a lot of plants that are winter deciduous, they'll lose their leaves when it gets too cold. Some plants like the California buckeye will lose their leaves when it gets dry. Some of them also have strategies to avoid that water stress. So they'll have really deep and extensive root systems that allow them to get water even when it's scarce, and also leaf characteristics that reduce water loss, like being small or having fewer stomata, being light colored, hairy. And some of them also have physiological adaptations that allow them to tolerate water stress better. So they can maintain photosynthesis and their cell water content and water movement better despite there not being a lot of water in the soil. And then some plants can also just recover from being desiccated or dehydrated. So I want you to keep that all in mind. However, of course, we have introduced irrigation into the system, and irrigation can overcome this summer water deficit and vastly expands the palette of plants that we can grow in our landscapes here, right? So many plants really love the temperatures that we have, but they can't deal with that water stress. And once we alleviate the water stress, we can plant all of those plants here. And that means that the precipitation element of our climate has largely been ignored when we've designed our urban landscapes. And that means that in a lot of California, we use a lot of water outdoors. And in a lot of places, more than half of residential water use goes to our landscapes. Okay, so that's all the background we need to be thinking about. But I want to talk about, with all of that in mind, how do we protect our existing landscapes? How will we expect climate change to affect our existing landscapes, and how can we protect our gardens and our trees? So some of the changes that are expected in Sacramento Valley's climate are, no surprise, warmer temperatures. So this is all from the fourth California Climate Assessment. The average daily maximum temperature could increase by 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And we also expect to get more extreme heat events. So it's not just the average, but more of these really high three-digit days. And also, as far as precipitation, we expect more extreme swings from wet to dry years. So our area of California already has pretty strong swings, right? We can talk about our average precipitation, but most years are above or below it. And that's going to become even stronger in the coming years. So that means that we can not only think about increasing drought intensity, but also increased winter storms that can impact our landscapes as well. And we're also expecting increased wildfires, which we've really already seen in the past, 5 or 6 years, both a longer fire season and then more large fires. Um, we're lucky in a lot of parts of Yolo County that our fire risk is relatively low, although that is not true once you get out near the coast range. But in areas where we're kind of surrounded by irrigated agriculture, we don't have as much risk of these fires, but we can still be really impacted by the smoke that they create. So how do we expect these extreme temperatures and extreme heat to affect our plants? So again, we're going to have that increased water demand. The higher temperatures mean that more water would be lost through transpiration, and transpiration is the plant's primary cooling mechanism. So if they need to close their stomata because they don't have enough water, or some plants will actually just close their stomata if it gets too hot, regardless of how much water there is, they lose that cooling benefit and can show signs of heat stress or damage. So we get leaf curling or leaf wilt, browning, and we can also get sunburn or sun scald. So this is something we might not think about with plants, but trees, especially trees that don't have very thick bark, can actually get sunburned, especially on southern and western exposure. And I believe this tree is actually right outside of the Yolo County Library in Davis. Pretty bad sunburn. They can also get what's called embolism or cavitation, where those xylem tissues, if you think about them like straws that are moving water from the roots through the trunk and out the branches and leaves, if there's a lot of pressure on them and not a lot of water, they can actually, if you think about it like you're sucking through a straw really hard and there's like nothing in the bottom of your Slurpee, it might collapse. It's not exactly the same with plants, but essentially they can kind of collapse or get an air bubble in them that prevents them from being able to transport water. So how do we protect our plants from extreme heat? First of all, we want to water them thoroughly in the morning on days when high temperatures are expected. So it's a really good idea to water early when possible. It's going to prevent that water from just immediately evaporating. It kind of prepares your plants for that day. But if you see signs of wilting, don't like wait until the next morning to water them. Give them water if they're wilting. With the exception of some plants, like squashes are going to look wilty by the end of the day, regardless of how much water they have. So they will probably be okay, but make sure to water them the next morning. And then we also want to water deeply. So we're ensuring that that water penetrates the rooting zone. So that means that it'll be able to be accessed by more roots. And you're also encouraging that plant to develop a deeper and wider root system so that it has more ability to take up water. And we also want to pay special attention to plants that are next to walkways or patios or generally reflective surfaces. Built surfaces can radiate heat onto plants, which can make the environment around that plant actually much, much hotter than a plant that's, surrounded by a lawn, say. And another great tactic is to add mulch around plants. So mulch, particularly arborist mulch or wood chip mulch, like you see in the picture here, can reduce moisture loss from the soil, and it also reduces soil temperature fluctuation. So it keeps that soil at a more constant temperature for the plants. Um, it can also, oh, maybe I have that later. Anyway, it can help to increase soil organic matter too if you use organic mulches, which can help with water retention. Um, we can also provide shade and bark protection. So as I mentioned, plants can actually get sunburn. So you can use a shade cloth or other material to provide direct sun protection. And then when we're thinking about trees and shrubs, their branches with leaves actually provide sun protection for their bark. And so you don't want to prune them when it's really hot out. Um, because those branches are protecting the trunk and the larger structural branches as well. So even if they're damaged, unless they're, causing danger, of course, you might want to leave them on to provide protection. And then another thing you can do where there is exposed bark, like on the trunk of this plum tree, you can actually paint it with a 50-50 mix of a just cheap interior latex paint and water. Paint that right on the trunk of the tree or an exposed branch, and that will help protect it from sunburn. You also really want to avoid applying fertilizers during high heat periods because fertilizers are going to stimulate new growth and that can add to plant stress, right? You have these tender new leaves, they need a lot of water, and it's more foliage for the plant to try to support. Okay, so moving on to fires, we have impacts of smoke. So smoke can introduce particulate matter and harmful chemicals to your plants. So coating on leaves can interfere with photosynthesis by blocking light. If you think about some of those fires we've gotten where there's literally like ash falling out of the sky, it can coat leaves, which can directly block sunlight, but they also often have damaging compounds in them that can interfere with photosynthesis. And in addition, in some cases, they can actually clog those stomata, so those pores that allow the plant to take in carbon dioxide and release water. So if it totally clogs up a pore, that can interfere with gas exchange, but it can also, interestingly, increase water loss if it gets kind of wedged in a pore and that pore can't close anymore, right? So um, these are some ways that just having a smoky environment can impact your plants. So, how do we protect our plants? Um, One way is to wash that smoke residue off with a gentle spray from a hose. Real important not to use a leaf blower because that can increase your own inhalation risk. We also just generally want to keep plants healthy and hydrated. So the better status they have, the less the better able they're going to be to make it through the stresses associated with smoke events. And again, we don't want to fertilize them until the air clears and the plants fully recover, because again, we don't want them putting out a whole bunch of tender new growth while they're in a stressful situation. All right. So, moving on to some strategies for really developing more climate resilient gardens and sustainable landscaping. I think the great thing about this is that we can really enhance the benefits that we get from urban landscaping in the process of making it more resilient. So, the first thing I want to talk about is landscape water conservation. And this is going to be increasingly important as we see this increased drought severity, where there's some years, we've had a few good years of precipitation, so it's easy to forget just how bad it can be some years when we really don't get a lot of precipitation in the winter, the reservoirs are dry. And then we also have often reduced uh, as the climate changes, we're seeing reduced snowpack. So more of the precipitation that we get up in the mountains is coming as rain instead of snow. And that is a problem because it means that our reservoirs will fill up really quickly. And then, we used to have this water bank where over the whole summer that snow would slowly melt and keep everything refreshed and keep our rivers flowing. And when that all comes as precipitation, we lose that long-term storage bank for water. There's also both local and statewide regulations that can limit the amount of water that we can put on our landscapes. And water conservation can help you save money on water bills. So these are all reasons that we want to think about conserving water in our landscapes. The first and honestly probably the most important thing we can do is improve irrigation efficiency. So you'll notice that this house is watering their sidewalk. And that is going straight into the gutter and it's not doing their plants any good. So, really important to make sure that you keep an eye on your irrigation system. You want to fix leaks. You want to check for uniformity. So, make sure that, if you have particularly sprinklers, but also like inline drip irrigation, you want to make sure that the water is coming out uniformly around your yard. So you don't have some places that are getting really overwatered in order to get other areas the water that they need. Obviously, if you have a broken sprinkler, it might be shooting water all over the place, needs to be replaced. And you also want to make sure that your sprays are properly directed. So again, in this case, they're really directed at the sidewalk instead of being just directed at the lawn where they should be pointed. And then flushing out clogged sprinklers or emitters can also help with that uniformity. And we also want to adjust our irrigation with the seasons and with the weather. So we're going to have higher demand for irrigation in July than we do in February. And in most cases, we can actually just turn our irrigation off entirely during the winter months. Um, but a lot of people kind of forget to do that. They just set it and forget it, and it goes off all year at the same amount when that really might be the amount that plants need in July, and you could turn it way down by the time you get to September. And if you're the type of person like me who tends to forget about things, not be 100% on top of them all the time, you might want to consider a weather-based irrigation controller. Um, these we have a lot of smart controllers now. They can be honestly kind of confusing to set up, but they do all the work for you of tracking the weather and adjusting your irrigation to match the water needs of your specific plants. And at least some of the cities in Yolo County do offer rebates for these weather-based irrigation controllers, so you can even save some money that way too. And then another thing you can consider is cycle and soak irrigation. So, if you have relatively low infiltration rates, um, you irrigate your landscape and then the water just starts to run off before the plants have gotten enough of it, basically. What you can do instead is turn it on for a shorter amount of time, but several times. So you turn your irrigation on for 10 minutes, you let that soak in, you wait for maybe half an hour, and then you turn it on for another 10 minutes and let that soak in. And that can help to prevent runoff while making sure that you get deep watering that's going to really encourage that deep root growth and drought tolerance for your plants. Another really important concept is hydrozoning. So, this is the process of grouping plants that have similar water needs. It sounds kind of obvious, but it's often not done because we think, oh, this yellow plant is going to look really pretty next to this purple plant. We don't necessarily think that this yellow plant actually needs twice as much water as this purple plant. And when you have plants with different water needs that are right next to each other, neither one of them is going to be happy, right? Overwatering can be just as harmful as underwatering. So there's no way necessarily, um, unless you want to get kind of fancy with your drip emitters, of providing really different amounts of water to different plants that are in the same zone. And then, of course, when you're thinking about how to arrange your plants, you can also consider other factors like what are their light requirements and soil requirements. So, really thinking about what plants belong together from more of an ecological perspective. What conditions do they need together? And then you can think about your design elements. And then we're going to design an irrigation system that has multiple independent zones and then schedule irrigation according to each area's watering needs. So you might have some areas of your yard that are being watered much more frequently or more deeply than others. And in general, we like to think of this hydrozone triangle where the largest square footage of our landscaped area is low water plants. And then we can have some area that's moderate plants. And then the smallest area would be those high water use plants. Um, so this is just an example of a house where we would have 5 different irrigation zones. So 3 of them would be low water use, and that's the most area. And then it's okay to have some moderate use water use plants. And then, maybe you have a lawn because there's pets and kids who need a place to play, but that's going to be our smallest area. And speaking of lawns, a lot of turf grass uses a lot of water, and in addition to that, it's often overwatered. So, a typical residential lawn can use hundreds of gallons of water per week. And there was a study in Los Angeles that also found that lawns were receiving generally about 40% more water on average than was even recommended for them. So, lawns have, I think, a reputation that is deserved of being very water hungry and potentially water wasteful. However, there are absolutely reasons to have turf. And if you're going to keep it, again, improving that irrigation efficiency can save a ton of water. And another way to keep your turf, but keep its water use down, is to provide it shade. So shaded turf actually uses about 50% less water than unshaded turf in the summer. And if you have trees with shaded turf under them, they actually use less water than just unshaded turf alone. And it will also probably slow your turf growth a little bit and reduce the management needs for it as well. Plus, you get that shade from your tree, which is going to provide cooling. And if you want to know more about turf grass management, we have a ton of resources on the UC A&R website. If you are thinking maybe you don't need a turf lawn, we have a lot of alternatives. So when possible, it's a great idea to replace high water use turf grass with low water turf grass. So there's a lot of turf grasses that don't need as much water, and can still provide a nice lawn. But we can also get a similar aesthetic by using alternative low water ground cover plants, like this Carapia here. Of course, just switching all of our lawns for like a monoculture of Carapia, maybe not the best thing, but at least Carapia also has some pollinator benefits. Or we can really change our whole aesthetic and go with water-wise landscaping, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Um, and in some areas, there are turf replacement rebates available for switching out your lawn for water-wise landscaping. Not so much in Yolo County. West Sacramento does have a program where they'll provide you with mulch if you want to do sheet mulching to convert your lawn, but otherwise, we don't have quite as many incentives in Yolo County as some other parts of the state. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it though. So, water-wise landscaping, what is it? Just essentially landscaping that uses water efficiently and reduces runoff as well. Um, Generally, we use climate adapted and low water use plants with efficient irrigation. So drip irrigation or hand watering tend to be more efficient than most spray irrigation. Of course, it depends on how you set it. Right. You can you can use all the water that you want with drip irrigation if you just set it to drip all the time. But in general, it tends to save water over spray irrigation. Again, those smart controllers that can help adjust your irrigation for the weather without you having to think about it all the time. Hydrozoning that we talked about. And then remembering to adjust your irrigation as your plants mature. So all plants are going to need a fair amount of water to get established. And they're also going to need that water more frequently, right? Because they have really small root balls. And so they dry out quickly. And so young plants are going to need much more frequent irrigation that doesn't go quite as deep, right? You want to encourage their roots to grow deep but you don't need to be irrigating quite as large and as deep a space as you would for mature plants. Mature plants, as they mature, you want to switch it over so that you're irrigating much less frequently and more deeply. And then we also want to think about retaining water in the landscape. So again, using mulches to help prevent evaporation from the soil. And again, that mulch can help provide soil organic matter that helps the soil to hold on to more water. And if you have any kind of a slope on your yard, I know a lot of Yolo County is pretty darn flat, but even a little bit of a slope can cause water to move potentially onto a sidewalk or a walkway. And you can use contours and swales to help direct the water into areas where you're sort of keeping it in the landscape so your plants can use it. Um, and on that note, we can also add some stormwater garden features if we're thinking about our wintertime garden needs. So features like rain gardens capture water and they filter it as well. So they can help to improve water quality. They can reduce flooding. So if you have a paved area, instead of having it, just run into a big puddle at the bottom of your driveway. If you direct that into a rain garden, it can help to prevent that flooding, help to clean the water, and also encourages groundwater recharge, which is really important. And if you plant it up nicely, you can also use it to provide habitat and biodiversity value. Um, and rain gardens are kind of special features because they require plants that can tolerate both those really wet conditions, right? Because they're going to be inundated if you get a big rainfall. But then in the summer, when you're not getting those big inundations, they're going to dry out, right? So they may require a little bit of irrigation in the summer, but some California riparian natives, so remember, I don't remember if I actually said it, but riparian plants are those ones that grow along rivers. And a lot of our smaller rivers and streams in California are intermittent, so they'll run in the winter, but then dry out in the summer. So plants that are adapted to growing along those intermittent streams can be a really good choice for your rain garden features. Pervious surfaces are also really helpful because they reduce that stormwater runoff. Again, they allow precipitation to soak into the ground instead of just running off into the gutter, which again can help to improve water quality, reduce flooding, and encourage that groundwater recharge. So it's a great idea if you're adding some hardscape to your landscape. Think about using porous materials that allow water to flow through them so you can actually get pervious asphalt or concrete that looks much like regular asphalt or concrete, but actually allows water to infiltrate. Or you can use blocks that are spaced out, like the ones in this photo, that have spaces for water to sink through in the gaps. So the benefits of water-wise landscaping can go beyond just water conservation, depending on what you plant and how you do it. So there's a lot of opportunity to increase habitat and biodiversity in your landscape. Can also improve soil fertility if we're adding a lot of mulch and compost and organic matter to the soil, potentially reducing energy and fuel use because you're no longer mowing a lawn. And if you choose plants that don't need other types of gas-powered equipment, that can also help to reduce that. Oftentimes, lawns can be pretty hungry for fertilizers and may need some pesticides. And if you choose your plants carefully in a water-wise landscape, you can really reduce the use of both pesticides and fertilizers. And I think add a lot of aesthetic interest if you choose interesting, cool plants, especially ones that maybe bloom at different times of year or have different colors and shapes of foliage. However, we do have this concern that all of this water conservation might affect urban heat as well, because remember, as plants are using water and transpiring, they're cooling themselves. but they're also cooling the air. So that is something that we need to think about as we're transitioning our landscapes to conserve water. So when we're thinking about the cooling benefits of plants, plants are really important for cooling our cities, which is becoming more and more important as our climate is warming. And they do this through both shading and transpiration. So, as I was saying, transpiration provides that evaporative cooling. And then shading, I think we can all just think about how it feels to stand under a tree on a hot day versus in the blasting sun. And so they provide that sort of thermal comfort for us under them, but they also prevent the sun from heating up pavement and other built surfaces and buildings. And then those built surfaces are really good at storing heat and they'll re-release it into the air, keeping things hotter. So, trees of all of our vegetation types really provide the most cooling because they have such large canopies. They can have a huge impact on surface temperature. They can also impact air temperature. Usually, that effect is quite less, but it can be up to about 2 degrees Celsius. And they really influence our thermal comfort, how we feel to be in a space. They can also reduce home energy use, right, by providing that shading and, reduce the amount that your air conditioner has to do the work instead. And by making it more comfortable for us, they can really encourage walking, biking, and public transit use, which helps to reduce that, not only the fossil fuel burning that's going to be contributing to overall climate change, but also that sort of immediate heat generation. So, all of our plants, but particularly trees, are really important for cooling. So, when you're converting your landscaping, don't forget that trees need water too. So, this is an example of a house in Davis that basically just shut off the irrigation to their lawn, probably trying to be really good in conserving water, but this tree is really struggling. So a lot of our mature shade trees actually need quite a lot of water, and that's in part because in the past we planted a lot of species from climates that receive a lot more precipitation, and so they are just adapted to needing more water. And in the past, they were also used to getting that lawn irrigation. So they developed root systems. Plant roots will grow where the water is. They probably have relatively shallow root systems that were used to getting that frequent turf irrigation. Not the best way to water a tree, but if that's what it's used to, that's what it's going to be relying on. And it's important to remember that it's not just the trees that are directly in your yard, but those street trees that might be even in a little, maybe not a median, but the sidewalk strip. They can rely on front yard irrigation too. So don't forget about them when you're trying to conserve water. So, protecting our existing trees, one of the most important things we can do. So during droughts and water restrictions, remember that trees come first. If you need to limit your irrigation water, give it to your trees. Mature trees take a really long time to get there, right? So if you lose a tree, you're not going to get that same shading benefit for decades to come. And we want to water our trees appropriately. So the best way to water trees is to give them deep and infrequent watering so that we encourage that deeper root growth. It makes the tree more stable and it also, encourages it to be getting water from a much larger volume of soil. And when we think about where to water a tree, we don't want to water it near the trunk. That's not going to do much for it at all and can actually be harmful to the tree because it can cause rot on some trees. Um, so instead, we want to water closer to the drip line, which is the edge of its canopy. That's where all of the roots are that are actually going to be absorbing water. They're concentrated in that area that's sort of around the edge of the canopy. Some trees' roots can actually extend far beyond their canopies as well. But if you set up, this is an example of a soaker hose. You can also do this with drip irrigation, or if you don't have anything set up, you can just use a garden hose in a few different quadrants around the tree. And you give it a really, really deep soak, maybe once a month. So you can use a screwdriver, like a long screwdriver, to see how deep the water has gone in the soil. And you want to make sure that it goes down ideally more than a foot into the soil. We also want to prune our trees properly. So please don't ever, 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 ever do this to a tree. Um, it's really important that trees are pruned properly so that we can maintain their canopy shading. When we just basically give them it feels like we're giving them a haircut, but we're really cutting off all of their organs that create food for them, right? That's what leaves are. They are organs that create food. And you've just taken off all of their photosynthetic capacity when you chop off all of their branches like this. And so what they're going to do is they're going to freak out and they're going to start sending up a whole bunch of shoots from the edges of those branches. And those are not going to have healthy branch attachments. They're going to be really weak and prone to breaking. And when we put a whole bunch of cuts like this on a tree, every one of those cuts is an opportunity for a pest or pathogen to get into that tree. So it's really important to work with a knowledgeable certified arborist if you want to be pruning larger mature trees. And we also want to plant our new trees thoughtfully. So we want to think about species that will be suited for the projected future climate, right? So a lot of the trees that we have right now were not necessarily planted with that idea in mind. Again, we have a lot of trees that need a lot of water. So ideally in the future, we want trees that can handle high temperatures and don't need quite so much water. And you also just want to think about the size and the characteristics that are appropriate for any particular planting location. So again, the water needs, but also how much space is there for a tree and how much space will a tree need? Because if you plant a huge tree in a place or a tree that will grow huge in a place that doesn't have much space or is under utilities or has infrastructure conflicts, that means you're going to be constantly pruning that tree and it's not going to be as healthy. And then you want to think about what types of benefits and also drawbacks you might get from a particular tree. Do you really need one that provides good shading? And you need to be careful about one that doesn't produce too much fruit or leaf litter if it's, say, over a sidewalk or a parking lot. And how strong are its branches? Is it likely to drop one on a car? In that case, you really don't want to put it in a parking lot. Not that any of you are necessarily planting trees in parking lots, but maybe next to your driveway would not be a great place for that tree. And then considering if there are any existing or emerging pest threats, we are really concerned about the emerald ash borer coming to California. It's not here yet, but it's not a great idea to plant an ash tree now because there's a good chance it's going to be taken out in the future by this pest if it gets here. And then lastly, we want to maintain diversity in our urban forest. So if a new pest does come in, it doesn't wipe out all of the trees in an area. So if your neighbor has a particular tree, even if you're like, I really love that tree, maybe think about planting something different. And I wanted to highlight that we have this new recommended tree list for Yolo County. This has been a huge endeavor, and it's a really wonderful resource that can be found currently on the City of Davis website. There's tons of options organized by different sizes of trees that we have vetted to be climate appropriate for this area. And some of them are for, regularly irrigated landscapes and some are for unirrigated landscapes as well. So check that out. And Finally, fire smart landscaping. So as I was saying before, some areas of Yolo County are more fire prone than others, but this is something that we really all do need to be thinking about a little more with increasing fire severity. So, fire smart landscaping generally combines plant selection, placement, and upkeep in a defensible space around a home to reduce fire danger. We're never going to eliminate fire danger, but we can reduce it. Um, so, when we're thinking about fire smart plant selection, I want to point out that the maintenance and the environment that a plant is planted in really matter more than the species itself. So, keeping your plants well hydrated will keep them more resistant, and remembering that dead thatch and other dead material are really flammable. So, we can choose species that have traits that help to reduce their flammability. So they have leaves that retain moisture better, lower in flammable resins, waxes, and oils. If they have more of an open structure as they grow, slower growth, low shedding. So the last three, we can prune things to have an open structure. And um, if you have a faster growing plant, you're just going to need to prune it more often to maintain that open structure. And again, a low shedding plant will create less dead material, but if you are really on it with maintenance, you can clean up dead material more often. So again, that fire smart maintenance is regularly removing those dead leaves, branches, and especially thinking about near structures, making sure that plants don't actually touch your home siding, windows, eaves, vents, or decks, and then again, watering sufficiently to maintain their health. But again, we want to be efficient about it. And then again, pruning for that open structure and health, removing thatch. And again, if you choose plants that already naturally have an open structure and don't produce a lot of thatch, that's going to make your job a lot easier to keep them fire safe. And then remembering to use non-combustible mulches near structures. So we love arborist mulch, but maybe don't put it right up against your house. Compost is a somewhat safer alternative to wood chip mulch. So when we think about how to select our plants, we want to select plants in general that are going to thrive in our changing climate. So we want ones that are going to be tolerant to the heat that we expect, don't require a ton of water, and are going to be resistant to known pests. Um, and it's really important, just like we were talking about with trees, to think about the right plant for the right place. So considering microclimates, again, like if you have a driveway or a patio that reflects heat, you're going to need plants that are even more heat tolerant. Um, if you have a place that gets water tends to pool there and it gets soggy, make sure you choose a plant that can tolerate that. Because otherwise you're going to have to do a lot more work and put a lot more resources and effort into keeping the plants healthy. Whereas if you choose a plant that is already adapted to the situation you have, it's going to do pretty well on its own. You're going to save yourself a lot of work and hassle and reduce your resource use. Um, I wanted to really quickly just sort of talk about the difference between drought tolerant versus low water plants. So remembering again that plants have a lot of different types of strategies to deal with drought and low water situation. So a drought tolerant plant is a plant that once it's established, it can survive through periods of water scarcity, like our seasonal waterfall, but it doesn't necessarily look good while it's doing it, right? So it might recover from wilting or dormancy. So if we think about our California buckeye again, they are absolutely gorgeous in the spring. This time of year, not looking so pretty. They're kind of, some people think they look dead, right? Because they're not expecting them to lose their leaves in August. Um, Whereas a low water plant is a classification for plants that are adapted to general overall water scarcity, and so they use water more efficiently. And that means that they can actually maintain their appearance without as much water. And so if we think about this sort of standard of low water lush, we can still have these lush, beautiful looking landscapes without using a ton of water. And this Lomandra is an example of a plant that's pretty good for that. When we think about our native plants, I think there's a lot of native plants that can be great choices for our landscapes here. They're adapted to our historical climate. Some of them may have trouble as the climate changes. And we also have to remember that our urban environments are pretty different than some of the habitats that they might be adapted to. But they can provide some great habitat value, and they also have a lot of cultural significance. So they can be really wonderful choices. But we want to, again, consider the context we're planting them into, and their particular coping strategies. So remembering that not all native plants are low water plants, right? Some of them are used to growing along rivers where they have water all year. They might have an annual lifestyle that might be great for parts of your landscape, but maybe not others. We have these highly altered urban environments, and then our changing climate may not favor our locally native plants. And I just wanted to leave you with some plant selection resources. I can maybe send this slide if that would be helpful, but I wanted to point out in particular that the UC Davis Arboretum All-Stars have been newly redone. They've done an amazing job, and they have a great searchable database of plants that are really vetted right here in Yolo County. The water use classification of landscape species database is way larger. You can find almost any landscape plant in there and see what its water needs are for our area. If you're thinking about trees, in addition to our own list, you can use the Select Tree database. Has, I think, over 2,000 trees. Pretty much anything you're going to find is going to be in there. They have tons of information about them. Calscape has native plants, really great database, and they're going to be having even more resources there soon. And then the California Native Plant Society also offers some planting guides that can be really helpful, especially if people are kind of overwhelmed by all the choices. And then just finally, creating these resilient landscapes is really a community service because plants help keep us healthy. They provide a positive environment for physical activity. They're associated with increased longevity, decreased mortality, heart rate, and weight. They can reduce our stress and give us a better ability to cope with major life issues. And plants have improved outcomes for people with depression, dementia, cancer, and a lot of other conditions. And they could even be effective at the scale of a pot of flowers. So thank you for all of your work to keep our landscapes beautiful. And yeah, what's the scariest thing in this photo? Might not be the spider, might be that water running into the gutter. So anyway. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope there's time for a few questions.
There's one question. Any chance we could get a printed copy of your PowerPoint?
Oh yeah, I could send that to you if that's
Mm-hmm.
helpful. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, if you send it to Joan and Jennifer, that would be great. They can then distribute it, and that'll include the list of sources of plants there at the end.
Oh, there's
Yeah.
spiders on the house. I didn't see the spiders on the
Well,
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? You're welcome to unmute and ask Joanna.
the others.
I have a question.
Sure.
Where's a good place to buy Lipia?
Yeah. Um, I don't know in particular, honestly. The Arboretum plant sale has tons and tons of plants. We have a lot of nurseries around here, but sorry, I don't know in particular.
Thanks. I can't find Libya.
Hmm.
Try Redwood Barn. Lipia is available at Oaktown in Berkeley.
Yeah,
Thank you.
actually, one of the great features of the Calscape website, I'm not sure how up to date it is, but they do, um, or at least they used to list nurseries where you could find particular plants. Here, I can stop sharing.
They still do list nurseries, Joanna, and I don't
Great,
know
thank you, Joy.
if they keep it up to date or not, I don't know, but
Yeah.
they do.
Okay, Mike, do you want to close and let people know
Joanna, did
what's
you want to
next?
say a word about the survey?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, let me see. Am I still screen sharing? There we go. Okay. Yeah, it would be super helpful for us if you'd be willing to take a short survey. It will be sent by the statewide Master Gardener program, not by one of us. And so, Mike, how would you like to collect emails?
Well, I think the best way is for them to either send Jennifer or Joan just an email saying you're willing to fill out the survey, which I think everybody has one or the other or both of those. I could put it in here though, real quick.
Okay, great. And this is for members of the public, not current Master
Yeah, not for
Gardeners.
master
Yeah.
gardeners.
So,
And
yeah,
then
thank you so much. We'd really, really appreciate your feedback.
see if I got these right. Yeah. Okay, so those should be there.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you, Joanna. So next session is going to be November 13th, and Treva Valentine, who is the Yolo Master Gardener. Many of you heard her presentations before, and I are going to talk about season extenders. We'll talk about construction and use of greenhouses, cold frames, and low tunnels for the winter, and mostly shade cloth in the summer. So just a way to extend more favorable circumstances for your plants in both winter and summer, have a place to maybe start some young plants, lots of different uses for those things. And that will be the last presentation of the year. As you know, 2 weeks after that's Thanksgiving, and then we take Christmas off, or excuse me, December off. So anyhow, thanks for coming, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you in on the 13th.
Okay, bye everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.